So we're going on to chapter 13 into the second section, and we're going on to be talking about these English kings. So the kings of England during this time between 1154 to 1399 to the 1400s. And these kings, as we went through down to the Norman kings, and we're going down to the descendants of King William, who was who was a Norman king, to the Plantagenets, to the Tudors. So these are just going to be names of the dynasties of kings, really, of England. Plantagenets. Well, where did the name Plantagenets come from? Well, let's find out. Henry II lived 1154 to 1199. There's a picture of him there. He was the grandson of Henry I, of course, who was very powerful on the mainland, descendant of William. And he called his reign starting because of his grandfather. His grandfather wore a bloom plant, or broom plant, I should say, in his hat. And so he called this a Plantagenet. So he said, we are the Plantagenets. Really weird, don't you think? But that's how it originated. So he ruled the territories not only of England, but of Anjou and Aquitaine in France. So at that time, England controlled a big area of France. In fact, he held more land in France than any of the French kings held. And he reestablished the royal authority, tore down the castles, and suppressed any unruly leaders. So Henry II was a strong leader. Henry's second laws, he started going over what kind of laws: common law, customary law, case by case set. So each law that would come through, trialed by they would have a jury there, a group of people to give this verdict, and this would set precedent over what the laws would be like, and the customary law, or common law of the people. And Henry had deep respect for law. He said, we will have law and order in England. And he believed the church was not above the law, that the church couldn't do anything they wanted to do. The church believed the Pope was above the law, but Henry did not believe the Pope was above the law. So rivalry developed between the church and Henry's knights. Henry's knights, they did not want to be under the Pope. But as for Henry's knights, he didn't have full control of his knights, and they ended up murdering the Archbishop of Canterbury from the Roman Catholic Church. They murdered Thomas E. Becket, which was really a mistake. The knights murdered that, pronouncing problems with the church in Rome, the Catholic Church in Rome. So Henry made penance and concessions to the church. He said, oh, sorry, my knights murdered your main guy. Sorry about this. And so he paid him some money to the church because he didn't want to go against the church. He did, but then he didn't. Why didn't he want to? Because he didn't want to go against the church, because the church had control, and the people, they had control of the sacraments and all these things, and the people would rebel. So let's go on to this character here. She is of Christian heritage, but we see a strong leader as a queen. Her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Very important that you know this name when it came to the kings, because she not only had her control and her political stand in the kings of France, but of England. The only queen that was a queen of France and then became queen of England, Eleanor. Basically, it says the secret Eleanor, because in history we don't know much about her, but she had great influence. Eleanor of Aquitaine. So let's talk about her right now. She lived between 1122 and 1204. It says she's a fascinating figure in what she did for Europe at that time. Again, she was the Queen of France and Queen of England. How did this happen? Well, when she was 15 years old, she inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine. The Duchy of Aquitaine, basically that area was considered a prime, as a prime area that England and France would both be fighting over, the Duchy of Aquitaine. And so she inherited, she was only 15 years old. And so then, in doing this, she became a woman of prominence, inheriting this large bit of land. You can see Aquitaine right here, large bit of land in France. And so, being the beautiful 15-year-old, I should say, she married the King of France, King Louis VII. King Louis VII was very famous because he was the one that went into the Crusades. You know, he went on the Crusades with the king to fight the Holy, and she went with him. As being only 15, 16 years old, she went down into Constantinople, the area of the Byzantines, and even into the Holy Land. No other queen traveled on the Crusades except for her. And so she found out all of the very wealth of the Byzantine Empire. So she found all the fashions and all the beauty that was there, and she would bring these things back to Europe. Later on, Louis VII, he was older than, remember she was 15. Well, she had 2 daughters, beautiful daughters. But he did not want a daughter to be queen, and he didn't want her influence anymore. And so he said that she was basically had rumors of infidelity, that she was having affairs, which she wasn't. She actually loved Louis. Well, Louis deserted her because he wanted a different woman, and he wanted a son. And so she said, we're going to put you away. I'm not going to kill you. I'm just going to put you away, and I'm going to marry another woman that I want better than you. So most of the time, women that or queens that were treated that way were put into convents to, where the nuns would take care of them, but not her. She was young and beautiful still, and she had her beautiful daughters with her. So what would Eleanor do? Would she just retreat into be in a convent with the nuns? No, she didn't. What did she do? Eleanor, she had met Henry II. And we talked about Henry II. Remember, he was the one with the laws and all this and everything. She influenced him back then. Well, she had met Henry II of England, the Plantagenet king. Remember? And he was the Duke of Anjou at that time, so he wasn't yet the King of England. Henry I was king, but she had met him, and he was a lot younger than her, but he had fallen in love with her, and he thought she was very beautiful. He had fallen in love with her, and so she married right after. The King of France was going to put her in a convent. Instead, she married the king, to be King of England. He would be the King of England. And so now when Henry I died, Henry II became the King of England, and she became the Queen of England. At that time, France was fighting over Aquitaine, which was her home, and so she fought as Aquitaine being English. It's part of France, and she wanted Aquitaine being English under her, of course, and her home was Aquitaine. She had her 2 daughters with the French king. So she has these French girls that she's amazingly training to be beautiful, beautiful women. And she would figure that all of her children would be active in royal lands. And so she had these 2 beautiful daughters. And when she married King Henry of England, she had 5 sons. Okay, baloney. The French king wanted sons. She had 5 of them with the English king. 5 sons and 3 daughters, making a total of 8 plus 2? 10 children. 2 of her sons would be English kings. We'll find out about Richard the Lionheart and John, which was her baby, which was not really, was very much of a spoiled brat. But anyway, and then her daughters and the rest would marry into royalty, and one of them would go into the church and become the Canterbury. And so basically you'll see all of her children, 10 children, had influence in the world at that time, not only in England, but in France and Spain and all over. They would know, especially her beautiful daughters, as they would marry in to kingdoms as queens and heirs. Eleanor's return to Aquitaine. Well, Henry II, he was 11 years older than she was. He started losing interest in her. She was getting too old, he thought, But instead, she returned to Aquitaine. She said she didn't want to, even though as queen, ruling as queen, she knew that Henry didn't want to have, he wanted to have other women, let's just say that. And so she returned to Aquitaine with her daughter Marie. Something beautiful happened there too, because she would put together in Aquitaine what was called the Court of Love. What was the Court of Love? She would teach knights how to have chivalry. She would say women need to be respected. And of course, two kings she had influence on, of course, they had gone away from her. And so she said, basically, how women need to be respected. And how women needed to be loyal but courageous. She would teach women how to be courageous as women. And she appointed a band of troubadours and poets to travel around and bring forth the heroic things and the Christian things of the way people should be. She taught manners and proper behavior, not just of the pagans and the barbarians, but how to have manners and beauty and be proper. And she taught and supported the arts and literature and these things of the land, which affected both France and England at that time. She died at the ripe old age of 82 in 1204, and she outlived those kings and the queens and the soldiers and the popes. She outlived them all. And as a strong woman of influence, she had great influence. And the people would always say, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and look up to her as a leader and a leader of good things. Her son, Richard the Lionheart, and he lived in 1189 to 1199. He was the son by Henry II, who she had married, the English Henry II, and Eleanor. That was one of her sons. Richard the Lionheart. He went into the Crusades, and he fought in combat exactly with the French, the French king, who is actually, his father had been Eleanor's husband at a time. So, but Richard the Lionheart and the King of France, which he'd be called King, the Augustus King, I should say, of all. Should I say? He named himself Augustus, like Caesar Augustus. Well, anyway, the French, so they became friends in the Crusades. And he loved the Crusades and combat. And we know that Richard the Lionheart, as we studied the Crusades, he went in and subdued the Crusades at that point, the Crusade of Kings, and went in and actually, we'd say, stopped the fighting of the Crusades for a while. Let's just say that. The Crusades, what were the Crusades? As we know before, they were the battles against the Muslim control in the Holy Land of Jerusalem and the areas of the Muslim kings, the Muslim sultans coming in and controlling that area. He was famous for his overtaking the Holy Land in the Crusade of Kings. I said that, and he was considered good and courageous. But like I said, he really only spent 6 months in England as king. Richard the Lionheart. When I think of Richard Lionheart and John here, you think of Robin Hood. If you have read The Adventures of Robin Hood or seen the movie and everything, both King Richard and John here are characters in there. John was another of Eleanor's sons, and John was the worst of the kings. So Eleanor, although she raised these children to be elite in royalty, John didn't turn out so good. John was a baby and he was spoiled, and they called John Lackland because he would not inherit any of the land. as a son that was not first son. Richard Lionheart was the first son. Well, when Richard died, John indeed would become king. But John was considered very selfish and very cruel and very treacherous. He was probably the most hated king in English history. Can you imagine that? King Philip Augustus of France was his enemy. And King Augustus of France was a friend of his brother, King Richard. But the King Augustus could not stand John either. So he had no allies or friends, really. He had taken half of England's possession, including Normandy, from John. So John had lacked land and lost part of this to France. John King quarreled with the Pope. Pope Innocent was not so innocent. He was a bad pope anyway, but he quarreled with the Pope against the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Pope didn't like him either. And so he took over the position. John took over the position and confiscating the Canterbury's property, and the Pope got mad, of course. And Pope Innocent then denied the people of England to church sacraments. So the Pope came in and said, okay, John, so you're not going to do what I tell you to do? Your people cannot have communion. They cannot go to have any of the sacraments. They can't go in they'll be excommunicated from the church, and so they will not be allowed, in the long run, they will not be allowed to go to heaven. That's what the Pope said back then. That's their control. So Pope Innocent excommunicated John and said that he would not be able to have any control of the church, not be able to go into the church, to have communion, which at that time, if you didn't have communion, you were considered mortal sin, or would not be able to have your last rites, would not be able to be baptized, all these things, and the people of England would not. So, of course, John, not only was he considered John lacked land, he lacked sense at that time, according to England. And so John, what did he do? John repented to the Pope. He goes to the Pope and says, okay, I'm sorry. All right. So John was trapped. His nobles alienated him, didn't like him. All the noble people, did not like him. He was hated. He had no friends or allies. And he ran to Pope Innocent. Pope Innocent was a bad, ugly pope, I should say that. He thought the Pope that thought he was God. And he repented. He said, I repent. And then he says, okay, go ahead, take all of England. I'll just give you England as a pope if I can repent. And I want to repent and I want to go to heaven and I want to follow you. And he was so messed up. And so he offered all of England and said, here, take it. Take England to the Pope. He says, here I resign the crown into the hands of Pope Innocent III. Pope Innocent, you can have England and be its king. Oh, that was the last resort for all the people of England. They were horrified. They didn't want the Pope Innocent as their king. And so patriots started arising all over England to fight against this drastic, ugly thing that John was doing. So, Runnymede. So what is Runnymede? Pretty important. They met outside of London in 1215. This is so important in history, in the history of the world. King John considered himself that he was above the law and he could do anything he wants with England. He could even give it to the Pope if he wants. And the people said, no, John is outside of the law. We need to set forth this law and that he cannot do this to us. And they believed that no man is above the law, not even the king, for political freedom and have to do with political freedom or liberties. King John must be placed under the common law of England. The common law was that, no, you had to rule the people. You couldn't do whatever you wanted with the people. So on June 15th, 1215, so 1515, just think, June 15th, 1215, English and Danish noblemen met at the meadow of Runnymede outside of London there at Runnymede. They all met together. It's a famous place if you go and see it. And they presented the great charter called the Magna Carta. So important because the Magna Carta would come later on as foundational in the history of the United States of America and our Constitution. They presented the Magna Carta on what the law would be, and John had no choice but to sign the Magna Carta, which he did. The Magna Carta had far greater implications than any other document up to that time. It took the ancient rights and privileges of the people, that the people had freedom and liberties. King Henry had started, the King Henry, before John, his great-grandfather, had put forth a charter of liberties, freedoms for the people, and made it clear that not even a king is above the law. If the king violated the law, he would be forced to obey the law, even though he was king. Wow, that was foundational. But it happened. That's how King Henry, remember, the lawgiver, had put forth, and it was common law, but it wasn't written down till now. The Magna Carta would be the rule of law now in 1215. It set the precedent for English and American constitutions and the rules and restraints for the rulers in violating subjects and freedoms, which meant now we'll have these rules. We got to write them down, because a king is not allowed to go give the people to a pope or any other country as a gift. Oh my goodness. Many precedents of freedom were set in the Magna Carta. It forbade the king to levy taxes without agreement with the Great Council, so they couldn't go out tax the people and tax people without the agreement of the council of men who agreed that these taxes were needed. There was no taxation without representation, which meant if you're going to be taxed, you need to have a representative there to say, why are you being taxed, so the people know why they're being taxed. And not to delay or deny justice to anyone, noble or not. Everyone would be able to give justice. Even if you were a peasant, you should be able to have justice given. Or even if you were the greatest king, you'd have to have justice. It didn't matter on whether you were poor or rich. Habeas corpus. What is habeas corpus? Was the right of arrested to appear before a court if imprisoned. So habeas corpus means if they took you and they put you in prison, that you had the right to go to court. With your peers, you had the right to go to court and have it presented. You couldn't just be put in prison for no reason, right? That you had the right to have legal representation. So you could not to imprison someone except by legal judgment of his peers or by law of the land. So you had legal representative with you. And then you also would have the right by trial by jury. A jury to trial, which we have now. But these set the precedents of freedom, and with the Magna Carta, because of John's dumb thing he did. So the rebellion of the nobles in the Parliament under Simon de Montfort. Simon de Montfort, he was a noble in the process underneath Henry III. In 1216, in John's rule. Henry III was John's son that went under his rule. I should say that, here we have John died, his son Henry came son, and then Henry was very weak and did all these mistakes. And Simon de Montfort was married to Henry's sister. So he's up there a bit. But Henry his mistakes were that he treated foreigners better than his own people. And the nobles were in rebellion under Simon de Montfort, because basically they were going to take control of the government in some way, and basically set forth in 1265 the first meeting of a parliament. The parliament were the kings of the Great Council of the Nobles. Parler means to speak in French. So Parliament were a group of counselors that would get together, these nobles that would get together and counsel the king on what to do and what not to do. So Simon de Montfort said, we need this Parliament because we need to talk to this king. He's doing the same dumb mistakes his dad John did. So we need to have this Parliament. So Simon set forth this Parliament. as a leader of the nobles, and invited the townspeople to come. And this was the beginning of the representative type of government. Edward Longshanks. Let's stop right there.